Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about change. As we know, when we talk about any kind of issue, unless we're talking about maybe granite or rocks or the formation of the universe, there aren't very many constants. When we talk about Native communities and things that happen in Native communities, it's really helpful to look at them in the context of change. And so what we're going to do is we're going to draw up a little timeline, and we're going to talk about some of the ways that things have changed, and then we're going to bring that back to a conversation about why is it maybe sometimes that it's hard to talk. This conversation came out of a discussion of people brainstorming ideas for Native-owned businesses, and some of the people in the room had a really difficult time. Not even being criticized, not even constructive criticism, but the idea that somebody else was adding on to what they were saying or changing what they were saying or trying to somehow collaborate and not let it be just one solid issue. And it was a really interesting discussion because people started to get back to that idea of why is it that we have a hard time talking to one another. This has come up in classes of mine before where a student has come forward and said, every time I say something, you tend to correct me, and I'm having a hard time with that. And it ended up that, as you know, I record a lot of my lectures. I went back and looked at it, and it actually was only maybe once every other lecture that I was actually saying, let's think about what you just said for a minute and reassess. I wasn't flat out saying, no, you're wrong or it needs to be changed. But it was a really difficult dynamic, and it's something that happens a lot in our communities, whether it's with band or tribal councils, or whether it's an annual review of educational programs in our communities. It's really difficult sometimes to sit down and have that conversation. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Let's start way back in the day. And in my community, we call this time period the time when animals were the people, and we'll call it animals. When animals were the people. Now, if we want to maybe find analogies and other world views to look at, we could say that maybe this is like in the Bible, when way back there was Adam and Eve, and there were these things that happened that maybe we can't attribute to actual real living people. But a lot of the values, a lot of the understandings, a lot of the beliefs come from this time period. These things exist today in what's commonly called fairy tales, where we derive a lot of our ethics, behavior that's right and wrong, ways that are appropriate or inappropriate when acting towards other people, towards ourselves, towards our environment. A lot of our values come from here. And also, another important thing that comes from this time period, or comes from these ethics, actually it's probably more accurate to say that it comes from the ethics and values, is this idea of, this is where kids learn right from wrong. And a lot of the times when kids make decisions, it's based off of things that they get from these fairy tales, these parts of the oral tradition that are not as easily understood as, say, a rule book or a set of city codes or some of the things that adults make decisions on. But there's a lot of this primarily comes from songs, from elders, from stories, and as kids in our community are growing up, they tend to learn a lot of these things. And then at some point, there's this transformation that happens, at least in my community, where we go from kids learning what's right and wrong from these things. We have the onset of adulthood. And this is different. I put the dashed line here. This is a little bit different because now decisions Decisions now are made based on experience. You could take that to be educational experience, your real world experience, your experience as a hunter, as a trapper, as a father, as somebody that has a job. You tend to be more of a critical thinker at this point. You're no longer making your decisions based on these morals of stories, but now you're making these decisions based on this adult thinking, this rational thinking. So way back when the animals were the people, we started off and we had the onset of human beings. In our community, we call this a psmucknik. They come around and we go through this long period, we're always moving in this direction, where we start to establish some very systemic ways of doing things. By systemic ways of doing things, I mean we come up with successful ways of hunting, gathering. We come up with successful ways, these systemic patterns for turning young people into older people, specifically by young men becoming men, young women becoming women, children becoming parents. We have these systems. Some of them are social systems. Some of them are land use systems. Some of them, another kind of system that we might say that we see here are our indigenous education. And what happens is these systems become very stable. We've talked a little bit about traditionally some native people and the resources that were at their disposal, for instance, at a key fishery, for instance, or in an overlap area or an area where different tribes or tribal groups share and have to coexist with resources. In my particular community, there were agreements between the Stoney Indians and the Ktunaxa that were living up around Windermere and Invermere, BC. World famous bison hunting grounds on one side of the divide and world famous fishing grounds on the other side of the divide. The First Nations place names in those areas talk about where the waters are red, and they're talking about where those fish are speared. We're also talking about where those bison are plenty. So we have not only ways of establishing these social patterns within our own community, but we're also now talking about establishing social patterns with other communities as well. There was a significant amount of resources, and over time we just developed these ways of people getting along, having these decentralized structures for distributing not just the food or the resources, but also some of those jobs, some of the attendant industries that go along with fishing, security, internal policing, all of these things. We developed them over time, and we came up with really great working relationships. So at this point, we can kind of, and I don't want to make it sound like it's too idealistic at this point, but here we have, when we think back about when we interview our elders about what it was like in the old days when things were good, and they'll usually say, well, we made our own decisions, we had agreements with the people around us, and generally everybody worked, provided stuff in our families, to our communities. We took care of one another. That's a really key thing when you interview those old people and you ask them about the old way. They'll say that we were able to take care of ourselves. We were able to take care of each other. And so then something comes along, and I'm going to use a different color. And I know this seems a little bit linear, like we're moving in one direction. And of course, life doesn't always know. I've just arbitrarily chosen this direction. And one of the students last week pointed this out, that now we have this new force that is coming down this direction, and they said, why did you use down? Is it because it's like it's a subliminal thing? You want us to think that it's bad? Well, I don't know necessarily about that, but I do know that we can say that as communities, as functioning First Nations communities, we're going along and we're establishing these patterns. And these might be what we would call equilibria. Doesn't mean that they're in one place, but it means there's some kind of a balance. We've kind of struck some balance, and things tend to be, there's some existing relationship, some ratio of inputs to outputs. There is some relationship between resource intake and resource outflow. There's just some way. We've kind of come up with these established ways of teaching ourselves. We've talked about it's very key traditionally in our communities that jobs are handed down through families. And the way that you do that is if you have a person that holds a particular job in one community and they're really good at it and you know what's going to be passed down into their family, you have an apprentice work with them. It's probably going to be from that family. Or maybe we randomly need a job to be filled and we say, well, who can fill it? Who has traditionally seen that job done the most? There's a pretty good chance it's probably the offspring of one of those people that did that job because they've grown up seeing it. They've internalized that. They kind of look at that as being maybe their rightful place. So we tend to have ways of fulfilling leadership. Land use systems, we tend to see that we know that tribes were always very competitive, and if suddenly there was a group that fell into some internal chaos, or someone decided to quit working, or there was a group of the social community that decided they weren't going to contribute, well, the neighboring tribes would probably step in and help you use those resources.